The night Sera Voss was rejected, it was raining so hard that no one could tell she was crying. She stood in the center of the pack's great hall barefoot, her white ceremony dress soaked through, her silver hair plastered against her cheeks while 200 wolves watched in silence. Not the silence of sympathy, the silence of people who had already decided this moment was inevitable. Alpha Dorian Vale stood before her with his jaw set and his golden eyes fixed somewhere just above her head, as if looking directly at her would cost him something. Behind him stood the woman he had chosen instead. Mara Holt, a human woman with no wolf blood, no pack ties, no moon bond. And yet, somehow, she was the one wearing the Alpha's mark on her wrist. Sera had spent her entire life being called the hollow girl, the Omega, born without a wolf, without a howl, without a single shred of the power that made her kind worth keeping. She had believed, with every quiet, desperate piece of herself, that the moon goddess had a reason for making her the way she was. That the reason was him. She had been wrong. As Dorian's voice carried the words of severance across the hall, cold, clean, final, the silver thread she had always felt connecting her chest to his simply snapped, and in the ringing silence that followed, something else stirred, something ancient, something that had been waiting inside her hollow bones for a very long time. What woke up in Sera Voss that night was not grief. So what was it? Chapter 1. Sera had been born in the wrong body. Or so the Vale Pack had always insisted. Every wolf carried a beast inside a second self of fur and instinct that surfaced at puberty, that howled at the full moon and made them something more than human. Sera had waited. At 13, she had pressed her palms flat against the cold floor of her bedroom and waited, trembling, for the shift to take her. It never came. Her mother had wept. Her father, the pack's lowest-ranking enforcer, had refused to look at her for a week. By 14, the nickname had spread through the pack like wildfire through dry grass. The Hollow Girl. An Omega who couldn't even manage to be a proper Omega. She was given the tasks no one wanted, washing the blood from the training mats after sparring sessions, cleaning the kitchen before dawn while the ranked wolves slept, running errands to the human town at the edge of their territory, in the cold and the dark. She did not complain. Complaining required a belief that things could be different, and Sera had quietly, carefully, surgically removed that belief from herself years ago. What she kept, instead, was a small and stubborn warmth that she could not quite explain, a sense that the silence inside her was not emptiness, but patience. The one exception to her invisible life was the children. The pack's nursery sat at the edge of the main compound, and Sera had been assigned there as a secondary duty, more punishment than privilege. The ranked wolves made sure she understood that. But the pups did not care about rank. They did not care that she had no wolf. 3-year-old Lena Vale, the Alpha's younger cousin, had developed the habit of falling asleep in Sera's arms during the afternoon rest hour, her tiny fist curled into the fabric of Sera's shirt, as though anchoring herself to something she trusted completely. Sera read to them from the old books, the ones the rest of the pack considered outdated, the ones that spoke of the moon goddess not as a distant deity, but as a mother who watched her children with fierce and particular love. The pups listened with wide eyes, and when the ranked wolves came to collect them in the evenings, Sera returned the children clean, calm, and smelling faintly of lavender, and no one ever said thank you. She did not expect them to. But she watched the door close behind each small body with the same hollow ache every single time, and she let herself feel it, because feeling it meant she was still there. Alpha Dorian had announced his choosing ceremony 6 weeks before it happened. The tradition was old. When an alpha selected a mate, they could either honor a moon bond or invoke the right of choice, declaring their mate before the pack, with or without the goddess's sanction. Moon bonds were considered sacred. A choosing was considered an insult to one, a statement that the alpha's judgment superseded divine design. No one said this out loud, but everyone thought it. The night Dorian Vale stood before his pack, with Mara Holt at his side, a human woman with kind eyes and no understanding of what she had walked into. Sera had stood in the back of the crowd and told herself she was fine. She had told herself the thread she felt between her ribs and his was a trick of her broken body. She had told herself all the right things, all the rational things, right up until the moment Dorian spoke the words of severance, the declaration that formally cut a wolf from any existing bond, however unacknowledged, and the pain hit her like a blade between the shoulder blades. She crumpled. She caught herself on the arm of a stranger, and she felt, in the exact moment of that pain, something enormous shift at the base of her spine. Chapter 2. The shift should have been impossible. Sera had not shifted in 23 years of living. She had no wolf. Every test, every examination, every cruel remark from the pack healers had confirmed it. She was hollow. She was broken. She was the hollow girl. But what surged up from the floor of her soul that night in the great hall was not the small, compact wolf that most pack members carried. It was something vast, something silver-white, and terrifyingly still, the way the ocean is still just before a wave breaks. It moved through her body not like a seizure, but like a tide, slow, inevitable, massive, and every wolf in the great hall felt it before they saw it. Dorian's head turned first. Then Mara's hand flew to her mouth. Then 200 wolves took a simultaneous step back, because the air pressure in the room had changed, because something ancient and unrepeatable was happening in the body of the girl they had called Hollow, and not one of them had any framework for what they were witnessing. Sera screamed not in pain, but in shock as white light cracked through her skin like lightning through glass. And then she was on all fours, and she was not small, and she was not hollow, and she was not anything she had ever been told she was. The wolf that stood in the wreckage of Sera's white ceremony dress was the size of a draft horse. Its fur was the color of moonlight on still water. Not white, exactly, but luminous, as though the light were coming from inside the coat rather than reflecting off it. Its eyes were silver gold. Its presence in the room registered not as a wolf but as a force, the kind of wordless pressure that makes the body respond before the mind catches up. Every ranked wolf in the hall lowered their head without choosing to. The instinct was older than thought, older than pack law, older than Dorian Vale's authority, or his golden eyes, or his declaration of severance. Even Dorian himself, alpha of the Vale pack, son of a bloodline that had held dominance for 6 generations, felt his chin dip. He caught it. He jerked his head back up, his jaw tight, his eyes blazing with something that was not quite rage and not quite fear, but lived in the same dark neighborhood as both. Sera, the wolf that had been Sera, stood in the center of the hall and breathed. In the old books she had read to the pups, there was a name for what she was. Not a broken omega, not a hollow girl. A moonborn, a wolf who carried a dormant beast of divine origin, who did not shift until the goddess herself gave the signal. The last recorded moonborn had lived 400 years ago. She had been a queen. Chapter 3. The shift reversed itself slowly, like the tide going out. Sera came back to her human body in pieces, first the cold of the stone floor against her palms, then the sound of shocked breathing from 200 wolves, then the acute and overwhelming awareness of her own nakedness as the ceremony dress lay in shredded tatters around her. Someone threw a cloak over her shoulders. She looked up, expecting no one she recognized. But it was Lena, little 3-year-old Lena Vale, who had somehow gotten loose from the upper gallery where the pups were kept during pack ceremonies, who had padded down the stairs on bare feet and crossed the great hall and draped her own tiny decorative cloak red wool, ridiculous, barely covering Sera's shoulders around the woman who read to her every afternoon. "You're pretty," Lena said seriously, looking up at Sera with enormous golden eyes. "Like the moon." Sera pulled the child against her chest and held on with both arms. She did not cry. She was past the point where crying was adequate. In the 3 days that followed the choosing ceremony, no one knew what to do with Sera Voss. Pack law had no protocol for a moonborn. The healers fluttered around her with their charts and their instruments, barely concealed excitement warring with barely concealed fear in their expressions. They confirmed what the shift had already told the room: she was not an omega. She had never been an omega. Her wolf had been dormant, yes, but beneath that dormancy lay a power signature so large and so strange that the instruments designed to measure wolf strength simply maxed out and stopped providing numbers. She was housed in the eastern wing of the main compound, better quarters than she had ever had, and fed actual meals instead of kitchen scraps, and spoken to with something approaching respect by wolves who had ignored her for years. She hated all of it. It felt like being recognized for the wrong reasons. She had not changed. Only their perception of her had. And the mechanism of that change had nothing to do with her as a person and everything to do with what they thought she could offer them now. But there was Lena. Lena, who visited every morning before her lessons, who crawled into Sera's bed and insisted on being told stories, who had apparently decided that whatever had happened in the Great Hall was simply the natural order of things. Sera was Sera. Sera was wonderful, and the fact that Sera could now turn into a wolf the size of a building was only slightly more interesting than the story about the moon rabbit who built a house from borrowed starlight. There was something in the child's uncomplicated certainty, her complete absence of an agenda that gave Sera somewhere to put her weight. Not a future. Not hope. Not yet. Just a small and warm and very definite present tense. She began to breathe differently around Lena. Slower. More like herself. She told the child the story of the moonborn queen from the old books carefully, with the dark parts softened, and Lena listened with her fist curled in the fabric of Sera's shirt, just as she always had, as though none of the last week had altered their particular gravity toward each other. On the fourth evening, Dorian Vale came to her room. He did not knock. He stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, and his golden eyes moving over her face like he was trying to read a language he hadn't studied. Mara was not with him. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, uncertain, and the uncertainty made him look younger, and the youth made him look, briefly and painfully, like the boy she had thought she loved. She waited. She had gotten very good at waiting. He said, finally, "I didn't know." She said, "I know you didn't." And then, because she was tired, and because it was true, and because she had promised herself years ago to stop withholding the things that were real, she said, "That's not the part that hurt." He stayed in the doorway for a long moment. Then he left. She sat in the silence he left behind and felt, for the first time, something that wasn't grief and wasn't rage, something more complicated, something that took up space in her chest like a root system, something that was the beginning, however distant, of her own becoming. Chapter 4. The Alpha King arrived on the 7th day, and everything broke. His name was Caden Ashvale, and he was not the kind of man you mistook for anything other than what he was, king of the 7 packs, holder of the blood covenant that had united the wolf nations for 3 centuries, and the single most powerful alpha alive. He came with 6 of his royal guard and no announcement, in the way that people come who have never needed to announce themselves. Sera heard the compound shift before she saw him, a change in the behavioral pattern of the wolves around her, a sudden formality in the way bodies oriented, the way sound itself seemed to quiet. She was in the nursery when it happened, sitting cross-legged on the floor with 4 pups arranged around her and a book open in her lap, and she felt him before she heard the door. A pressure at the base of her skull, like the moment before a storm breaks. He stood in the doorway of the nursery for exactly 3 seconds before his eyes found her. They were a particular shade of gray, not soft gray, not winter gray, but the gray of deep ocean water, and they did something to the air between them that Sera had no language for. Lena, oblivious and imperious in the way that very small children can be, pointed at him and announced, "That's Sera's wolf. She's the biggest." Caden Ashvale looked at the child. Then he looked at Sera again, and something moved behind his eyes that she could not name. She stood. The pups arranged themselves behind her legs without being asked, and the instinct of its small bodies pressing against the backs of her knees, trusting her completely steadied her more than any amount of courage could have. Dorian Vale appeared behind the king and began to speak. The words came in a formal rush rank, lineage, power assessment, the pack's legal confusion about how to classify a moonborn, and Sera listened to him describe her the way a person describes a discovered artifact. Something rare, something valuable, something whose ownership needed to be determined. She watched Caden Ashvale's face as Dorian spoke, and she saw the exact moment the king's expression closed, a subtle shift, like a curtain dropping behind glass, and she understood, with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime reading rooms that had no interest in being read, that something had been decided. She just didn't know yet what it would cost her. What it cost her was Lena. Caden Ashvale declared, with the absolute and unreviewable authority of the blood covenant, that the moonborn could not remain in a standard pack. Her power signature was too large, too destabilizing to pack hierarchy. She would be remanded to the royal compound for assessment, documentation, and the word he chose was care, but the word he meant was containment. She would go immediately. She would go alone. She looked at Lena's face when the guards came and felt the world end quietly inside her chest, the child's golden eyes going wide with confusion, her small hand reaching, her voice saying, "Sera?" in a tone that had no understanding of finality in it at all. Sera knelt and pressed her lips against the top of Lena's head, breathed in the warm pup smell of her, memorized it, and did not let herself hold on. "I'll come back," she said. She said it like a promise because it was. She said it even though she had no power to keep it. She said it because Lena needed to hear it, and because sometimes the only gift you have left is the thing you cannot guarantee. Dorian watched the guards escort her out with his arms folded and his jaw set and his eyes fixed somewhere above her head, just as they had been the night of the ceremony, as though looking at her directly still cost him something, as though the habit of not seeing her was the one thing he could not break. Mara Holt stood at his shoulder with her kind human eyes full of an apology she had no right to make. Sera did not look at either of them. She walked out of the Veil Pack compound with her head level and her hands steady, and the sound of Lena's voice saying her name echoing in the hollow place that had never been hollow at all. Chapter 5. The Royal Assessment Facility was a beautiful cage. The architecture was old stone and high ceilings. The grounds were well maintained. The food was excellent, and Sera was alone in it for 31 days, with no visitors, no pups, no books that weren't approved by the royal archivists, and no information about Lena or the Veil Pack, or anything outside the compound walls. The guards were not cruel. Cruelty would have required them to see her as a person, and what they saw instead was a subject of study, something to be measured, documented, assessed. She submitted to the examinations with the patient stillness she had cultivated over a lifetime of being treated as less than she was. She answered the archivist's questions in full sentences. She allowed the healers to take her blood and catalog her power signature and make their charts. She did not rage. She did not beg. But at night, alone in a room that was too quiet and too clean and too far from the small warm weight of Lena sleeping against her chest, she lay on her back and stared at the ceiling and felt herself becoming thin. She had survived the Veil Pack's indifference by keeping that small warmth inside her, the stubborn, inexplicable certainty that she mattered, that her silence was patience rather than emptiness, that the moon goddess had a purpose for her life. 31 days of solitude did not break that belief, but it bent it. It bent it at an angle she had never felt before, and the new shape of it frightened her more than any cruelty the Veil Pack had ever offered. Because the cruelties of others had always had an outside origin, something imposed on her, something she could orient against, something that left the interior self intact. This was different. This was the slow dissolution of self that happens when no one sees you for long enough. She began to wonder, in the small hours of the night, whether the wolf that had emerged from her in the great hall had been real, or whether she had imagined the whole thing as a final, beautiful defense against unbearable loss. She began to wonder whether she had ever been anything other than what they had called her, and the wondering terrified her far more than the guards or the walls or the exile. On the 32nd day, she stopped eating. Chapter 6. She did not decide to stop eating the way you decide to do something active. It was more like a cessation, like a clock running down. The tray came, and she looked at it, and it seemed to belong to a version of existence she no longer had the energy to maintain. The healer noticed by the 2nd day. The archivist noticed by the 3rd. On the 4th day, Caden Ashvale himself came to the assessment room, and this time he was alone. He sat across from her at the small table where the untouched tray waited, and he did not speak for a long moment. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her in the nursery, with that quality of attention that felt less like scrutiny and more like reading, like trying to understand something that mattered to get right. She stared back at him with the flat, careful eyes of someone who had decided to stop defending themselves from further disappointment. He said, finally, "The little girl has been asking for you every day." Something cracked open in Sera's chest. She did not let it show on her face, but she felt it, a sudden, violent return of feeling, like blood returning to a limb you'd forgotten was numb. "She drew you a picture," he continued, and he placed it on the table between them, a sheet of paper covered in the chaotic, earnest scrawl of a 3-year-old's art. a large silver shape that Sera understood, after a moment, to be a wolf. A small red shape beside it, and above them both, carefully drawn circles that were probably moons. She picked up the picture with both hands and held it, and the cracking in her chest became something that was going to require a different room, a room she did not have. She pressed her lips together. She breathed through her nose. And Caden Ashvale, king of the 7 packs, said nothing. He just waited, with a patience she would not have attributed to him, while she held a child's drawing and tried not to fall apart at his table. After a long time, she said, "Why are you here?" He said, "Because no one else was." She looked at him. He looked back, and the curtain she had seen drop behind his eyes in the nursery was not there, just the gray of deep water and something behind it that she could not name, but that looked, improbably, like anger. Not at her. For her. "I was misinformed about the conditions of your assessment," he said. "The isolation was not authorized by me." She did not know whether to believe him. She decided, against every instinct sharpened by a lifetime of disappointment, to take the statement at face value. Not because she trusted him yet, but because the only alternative was to go further into the thin place, and she was not ready to disappear. Chapter 7. He moved her out of the assessment facility the following morning and into the secondary residence of the royal compound, an entirely different structure, smaller, older, with a garden that smelled like rain-wet stone and a library that was not curated or censored or approved by anyone. She was given an attendant, a wolf named Dara, who spoke to her like a person and brought her tea in the mornings without being asked and seemed, remarkably, to have no agenda. She began to eat again, slowly, carefully, the way you relearn a language you have not spoken in some time. She began, also, to read. The uncensored library was full of material the archivists had not wanted her to access, and she moved through it with the quiet urgency of someone gathering supplies for a journey she had not yet mapped. The history of the Moonborn ran deeper than the old books she had read to Lena. The archivists' versions had been clean, summary, stripped of anything uncomfortable. The full accounts were something else entirely. The last Moonborn had not simply been a queen, she had been the foundational authority of the blood covenant itself. The wolf whose power had made the 7-pack union possible, whose lineage had been deliberately obscured after her death to prevent what the ruling alphas of the time had feared most. A challenge to the hierarchy they had built in her absence. The obliteration had been thorough, systematic. Someone had worked very hard to ensure that no Moonborn would ever know what they were before they were old enough to be managed. Sera sat with this information for a long time. She thought about her father's averted gaze. She thought about the healers and their charts. She thought about the word hollow and the work it had done, and who had benefited from her believing it. The path between the secondary residence and Caden Ashvale's working quarters crossed a courtyard where the royal guard trained in the early mornings. She began to cross it deliberately, at the same hour every day, not because she needed to, but because each crossing was a small act of presence of "I am here, I exist, I take up space" that she had been systematically denied for 23 years and was not willing to be denied any longer. The guards began to nod to her. Dara brought her better tea. The garden bloomed, slowly, as spring leaned into the stone walls of the compound. And Caden Ashvale appeared in the courtyard one morning and watched her cross it without speaking, and she felt his gaze on her back like a hand placed carefully between the shoulder blades, not pushing, steadying. She had not decided what to do with him yet. He was a king, which meant he was a system of power she did not yet understand and could not yet trust. He had also sat across from her at a small table and waited while she held a child's drawing and tried not to disappear, and he had been angry for her rather than at her. And these were not small things. She was building a map of him from small data points the way you build a fire carefully, with attention to what will hold and what will catch. She did not hurry. She had learned, in 31 days of careful dissolution, that she did not have the luxury of rushing toward comfort anymore. Every next step had to be load-bearing. Chapter 8. Lena arrived at the royal compound on an overcast Thursday morning, 49 days after Sera had last seen her. She came with Dorian and a formal delegation from the Vale Pack, some business of the blood covenant that Sera was not party to, and the manner of her coming was official and managed and entirely irrelevant. because the moment the convoy entered the main courtyard and the doors of the first vehicle opened, Lena hit the ground running. She ran the full length of the courtyard in her small red shoes, arms already outstretched, face already brilliant with the particular joy of a child who has decided that all the time between this moment and the last time was simply an error to be corrected. She hit Sera at full speed, and Sera caught her and they went down together onto the courtyard stones. Lena wrapped around her neck, face pressed into her hair, saying her name in the rapid, breathless repetition of a child verifying that something is real. Sera held on. She held on with both arms and both hands and everything she had, kneeling on the cold stones of a king's courtyard, and she let herself feel the full weight of the last 49 days, the thin place, the dissolution, the careful and exhausting work of reconstituting herself from the drawing of a silver wolf and a cup of morning tea and a man's anger given to her like a gift, and she did not edit it, and she did not apologize for it. She simply held the child and breathed. When she finally looked up, Dorian Vale was standing at the edge of the courtyard, with his arms at his sides, and an expression on his face she had never seen there before, something undefended, something that looked like it cost him to hold. She looked at him for exactly as long as it took her to understand that whatever he was feeling was his to carry now. Then she looked away. Caden Ashvale was standing on the steps of the main building. He was watching Lena, but his gaze moved to Sera a moment later, and the gray of his eyes in the overcast morning light was very still and very deep, and she thought with the steady, careful precision of someone who had learned to trust their own reading of things that he had arranged this. Not officially, not through any channel Dorian could object to, but the timing of the Vale Pack's summons, the specific week, the particular morning, she did not think it was coincidence. She thought it was a man using the machinery available to him to give her back something that had been taken. She held Lena closer and let the warmth of it move through her like the tide, slow and inevitable and enormous, and she thought, this is where the map starts. Chapter 9. The archivist came to her 3 days after Lena's arrival, in the evening, with a folder of documents he handled with both hands and an expression that suggested he had been deciding whether to bring them for some time. He laid them on the table in the library and did not sit down, and said, "The king asked me to show you these. He said you should see them before he speaks to you." She looked at him. He looked at the folder. She opened it. The first document was a lineage chart, the kind the packs use to track bloodlines over generations. She found her own name at the bottom almost immediately. Above it was her father's name. Above that, a name she did not recognize. She followed the line upward through the chart for 4 more generations before the name stopped her. She read it twice. Then she pressed her fingertips flat against the page and breathed. The name at the top of her lineage was Sera Voss, the last moonborn queen, the one the ruling alphas had erased, the one who had made the blood covenant possible, her ancestor, her origin. The reason the word hollow had been so carefully, so systematically applied to her since birth. Because someone in the Vale Pack, not Dorian, who was too young, but someone behind him, someone older, someone who had managed the Pack's knowledge for decades, had known exactly what Sera was, had always known, had understood that a living moonborn was a threat to the hierarchy built on the Queen's erased legacy, and had made the strategic decision to keep her broken and small and unable to claim what she was until she could be used or until she ceased to be a problem. She sat with this for a long time. The archivist left. The library was very quiet. Outside the window, the compound's evening lights were coming on one by one, and she could hear, distantly, the sound of Lena in the garden with Dara, demanding to be shown how to identify the constellations. Sera thought about her father's averted gaze, and understood now that it had not been shame but fear. She thought about the healers and their instruments and the word hollow, and understood that words are the first weapons and that the most effective cages are built from language, and that she had walked into hers so young she had thought it was simply the shape of the world. She was not angry, or rather, she was angry, but the anger was enormous and clean, like the wolf that had risen out of her in the great hall, and it did not make her want to destroy. It made her want to stand up very straight and be seen very clearly, and take up every inch of space that had always been hers. Caden Ashvale found her in the library an hour later. He sat across from her the way he had in the assessment room without the table's formality. Just two people in chairs with the truth between them. "You knew," she said. It was not an accusation. "Not at first," he said. "I suspected what you were in the Valepack nursery. The documents took longer to locate than I'd like to admit. They were buried with considerable intent." She looked at him. "You're Alpha. Dorian Vale's father," he said carefully. "He was the one who identified what you were, at birth. He was the one who gave the order." She absorbed this. It was not surprising. It was simply the shape of what had been done, which she had already known in outline and now knew in full. "What happens now?" she asked. He met her eyes, and the gray of his was very steady, very open, very like a man who had decided to be exactly what he was, with no concealment available. "That depends on you," he said. "You are, by blood and by power and by every law the Covenant was built on, the rightful inheritor of Kalindra's authority, which means you outrank everyone in every pack in the 7 nations. Including me." A silence. "Including you," she said. "Yes," he said. And then, quietly, "I've been waiting for you for a long time. I didn't know I was, but I have been." Final chapter. She did not take the authority immediately. She was not built for the kind of power that arrives loudly, announces itself, and demands acknowledgement before it has earned trust. Instead, she took the documents and the lineage chart and the understanding of what she was, and she spent a week sitting with all of it in the library, while Lena played in the garden, and Dara brought tea, and Caden Ashvale came every evening to sit across from her and simply be present, no agenda, no pressure, no timeline. It was, she thought, the most deliberate thing she had ever seen a powerful person do. The restraint of it, the patience of it, the quality of attention he gave her that was so entirely unlike being assessed or measured or managed. He was interested in her, not in the Moonborn, not in the blood covenant implications, not in the political solution she represented. He was interested in what she thought about the story of the moon rabbit who built a house from borrowed starlight, and why she had kept reading to the Valepack pups long after it stopped being survivable to care about anything, and what the hollow place had felt like from the inside when she had believed in it. She told him. She told him things she had never told anyone, not because he asked the right questions, but because he made the silence safe enough to fill. And in the telling, something shifted. Not dramatically, not with white light and cracked stone. Quietly, the way the tide shifts the way morning comes in. Not all at once, but incrementally, light finding the edges of things before it fills them. She stopped being the hollow girl. Not because she hadn't always been something more than that she had been. She had always been, the stillness inside her had always been patience, and not emptiness. But she stopped believing in the name at all, and the space the name had occupied became available for something else. The formal declaration happened on a morning in early summer, in the great hall of the royal compound, before representatives of all 7 packs. She wore no ceremony dress. She wore the plain clothes she had chosen herself, and her silver hair loose and her feet in practical boots. And she stood in the center of the hall with her hands still and her chin level, and let the moon-born wolf rise just enough to fill the room, not threatening, not performing, just present, just real, just the simple, overwhelming truth of what she was. Every wolf in the hall lowered their heads. She did not ask them to. They could not have helped it. She met Caden Ashvale's eyes across the room, and he was the only one who had not lowered his gaze. He was looking at her with his head up and his gray eyes steady, and there was something in his expression that she recognized now, the particular look of a person who is exactly where they chose to be. He nodded to her, once. Not submission, acknowledgement. The difference, she had come to understand, was everything. Dorian Vale stood in the delegation from the Valepack with Mara at his side and his golden eyes on the floor. And Sera felt in the last moment before she spoke the words of her declaration that she had been wrong about the thread between them. It had not been a bond. It had been a leash, and the goddess had not snapped it in cruelty. She had cut it, precisely and mercifully, with the first words of severance, so that Sera could learn the difference between being tethered to someone and being free. She had given her the greatest gift available, the removal of the thing that was keeping her small. And in its place, she had given her a great hall and a silver wolf and a king who had been waiting, without knowing it, for the woman the Valepack had called hollow. Lena would be returned to her. The blood covenant would be re-established under its rightful lineage. And Sera Voss, who had been born in the wrong body, who had waited in the dark for a wolf that was taking its time, who had read moonrabbit stories to children who trusted her completely and had never been thanked for it, would take up every inch of space that had always been hers. She opened her mouth, and she spoke, and the words fell into the room like light finding the edges of things before it fills them. And outside the windows of the royal compound, summer was arriving without asking anyone's permission, and it was very, very bright.